At my daughter's wedding, her new husband threw me out of my own restaurant. I'm Raymond Holt. What happened next changed everything. Picture this. Your child just got married. You're supposed to be celebrating the best day of her life. And your son-in-law looks you in the eye and says, "You're an embarrassment to this family. Hand over the keys and step aside." He called me a washed-up burden in front of 50 guests at my own daughter's wedding reception. But here's what Brandon didn't know: the restaurant he was kicking me out of. I built it from nothing in 1991. The catering business he thought he was about to inherit $2 million in active annual contracts that was always mine and only mine. For 6 years, he had lived off my daughter's connection to my family business while treating me like an inconvenience instead of the person who built the whole thing. Instead of making a scene, I handed him the key and walked out into the parking lot alone. Sometimes the quietest exit is the loudest statement of all. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I share stories about standing up to disrespect, and trust me, you will want to see how this ends. Because what Brandon discovered 4 days later taught all of us that arrogance has a real price. And sometimes that price is everything you thought you had. Let me start from the beginning. The warning signs were there from the very first dinner I had with Brandon Cole. I chose to overlook them because my daughter was happy, and Donna always told me not to lead with suspicion. When Claire announced she was marrying him 2 years ago, I shook his hand and meant it. He had the grip of a man who'd been taught that a firm handshake signals confidence, and a salesman's smile that arrived a half second before it should have. Brandon worked in commercial real estate development. Not a bad profession. But he'd been between significant projects for 8 months when Claire first brought him to the house. He talked constantly about future deals, strategic partnerships, industry contacts he was carefully cultivating. I listened and poured the wine and offered very little back. My late wife Donna used to say that the men who talk most about their future success are the ones most afraid of their present situation. I thought about Donna throughout that dinner. She would have understood Brandon in about 4 minutes. The first real signal came 6 months into their engagement when Brandon began showing up at Holt's Kitchen. That's the name I gave the restaurant when I opened it. After my family, not to eat, but to watch. He'd take a stool at the bar with a club soda and study the floor like a man running calculations on something that didn't belong to him yet. He started asking my head chef Gary questions about food costs and preferred vendors. He asked my bookkeeper Linda how we tracked catering client relationships and processed large invoices. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was getting familiar with the operation because it was going to be part of the family now. Part of the family. Those words bothered me when he said them. I should have examined that feeling more closely instead of setting it aside. Claire and Brandon married on a crisp Saturday afternoon in October, and the kind of fall day my wife would have called perfect for a new beginning. The ceremony was at St. Michael's Church, the same church where Donna and I had married 32 years ago, where we'd had Claire baptized, where we'd said goodbye to Donna 3 years earlier, in a service that left me standing at the altar wondering how to go home to a house that was suddenly just a house. After the ceremony, the reception moved to Holt's Kitchen. I'd closed the restaurant for the private event, and my staff had spent 2 days transforming the dining room with white flowers and warm light until it looked like the kind of place Donna always believed it could be. I stood near the kitchen pass-through the way I always did during service, watching the floor run smoothly, feeling the specific satisfaction of seeing something you built operate exactly the way you always intended. Then Brandon appeared at my elbow. He was already on his 3rd whiskey. He said, "Ray, we need a real talk about the future of this place." I said we could have that conversation Monday morning. He said no. Tonight. I looked across the room at my daughter. Claire was laughing with her bridesmaids, untouched by whatever this was becoming. I asked what was so urgent it couldn't wait 48 hours. He said, "Claire and I have decided you need to step back from operations. You're 64 years old. The restaurant needs new leadership." I set my glass down with deliberate care and told him that Holt's Kitchen was my business, built with my money and my labor, and that no one was making decisions about its future except me. He smiled, the particular smile of someone who has already decided the negotiation is over. He said, "That's not how family works. Ray, you're family now. Family shares." I looked at him for a moment. Then I excused myself to check on the kitchen pass-through. When I returned, Brandon had positioned himself between my catering manager and two of my oldest corporate clients, talking loudly about expansion strategies and modernization and what the business could become with fresh vision at the helm. My clients were nodding with the polite attention of people who aren't quite sure what they've walked into. I watched him for 10 minutes. Then Claire caught my eye from across the room and gave me the small, private smile that looks exactly like Donna's used to look. So I let the evening go. But I did not let it go completely. Sunday morning brought the worst version of Brandon yet. I was walking through the dining room before service when he arrived unannounced with two colleagues from his real estate network. He introduced them as consultants who wanted to assess the space's commercial potential. I hadn't invited them. He hadn't asked. One of them, a younger man with an expensive watch, started photographing the kitchen layout on his phone. The other one walked the dining room measuring something with a laser tool he'd brought in a bag. Brandon stood in the center of my restaurant watching them work like a property manager supervising a site visit. He looked at me and said, "Ray, sometimes you have to see something with new eyes before you can see what it could be." I asked him to have his consultants stop photographing my kitchen. He said they were just doing preliminary analysis. I said I hadn't authorized any analysis. He said with the transition coming, this kind of assessment was necessary groundwork. I told him there was no transition coming. He smiled at his colleagues, an apologetic smile, the kind you offer when an elderly relative is being difficult, and said perhaps we should discuss this privately. The consultants quietly put their equipment away while studying the ceiling. Brandon's performance was seamless. He'd been running this play long enough to have the moves down. But what Brandon couldn't see from where he was standing was that I'd already made my own moves, and they had been in place for 33 years. Let me tell you what I actually had in that filing cabinet in the back office, because this matters for everything that follows. When Donna and I opened Holt's Kitchen, we did it properly. No partners, no investors, no financing. I took everything I had saved during 12 years of working in other people's kitchens and bought a lease and equipment and built something from a blank room with 6 tables. Donna did the books. I did everything else. The restaurant is mine in every legal sense: lease, licenses, permits, liability insurance, equipment, ownership, all Raymond Holt. Sole proprietor. But what nobody on the outside knew about, including apparently my son-in-law, was the second entity, Holt's Premium Catering LLC. Established in 2009 when the catering side of the business outgrew what the restaurant's kitchen could support, I had purchased a separate commercial kitchen facility 3 miles from the restaurant, its own address, its own full-time staff of 11 people, its own equipment, its own contracts. The catering division ran 12 active corporate accounts, generating $2.1 million in annual contract value. Brandon had done enough research to find the restaurant on Harbor Way. He had not done enough research to find anything else. He had built his entire acquisition strategy around one address and missed the engine running the operation. There is something I should tell you about what the catering business actually meant to me beyond the revenue numbers. Donna and I started doing private catering out of the restaurant in 1998, almost by accident. A client whose corporate holiday party we'd catered once told 2 colleagues, and those 2 told their companies. And within 3 years, the catering work had become more than the restaurant on its best nights. We hired staff specifically for catering. We developed menus that existed nowhere else. We built relationships with clients who have been with us for 15 and 18 and 20 years. Those relationships are not assets in a spreadsheet. They are the result of thousands of small decisions made correctly over decades. When I purchased the commercial kitchen facility in 2018, I wasn't expanding. I was protecting something irreplaceable. Brandon had looked at one address and seen a business. He had not looked at what that business actually was. Monday and Tuesday I said nothing in response to anything Brandon sent. Wednesday, Claire called. She said Brandon told her I wasn't engaging with the restructuring discussion. I told her I was giving it proper consideration. She said he was only trying to help the business grow, and I should give him a fair chance to contribute. I asked whether she had read the full proposal document or just the summary. Pause. She said the overview. I asked if she'd seen the section requiring Brandon's co-signature on vendor contracts I had been managing alone for 3 decades. Another pause. She said he just wanted to be involved. I said I understood and would be in touch when I was ready. The call ended pleasantly enough. But something in me had finished waiting. Brandon was working Claire the same way he'd worked my clients at the reception. Enough plans. Enough confident language. Enough sustained performance that everyone around him began assuming he already had authority he had never actually been given. The following Sunday, he brought her to the restaurant for brunch and sat in my corner booth, the one I have eaten breakfast in every morning for 30 years. The one Donna used to slide into across from me and steal coffee from my cup, and he began directing my staff as though the managing director title were already active. He questioned my kitchen manager about produce sourcing. He told my front-of-house manager, Sarah, that the room layout was losing covers. He asked Linda if he could review the catering contract archive when she had a moment available. Linda looked at me from across the room. I shook my head the smallest amount. She told Brandon the files were in an active audit and unavailable at present. Brandon gave me the steady look of a man managing a difficult but temporary obstacle. That afternoon, while Claire was in the restroom, he sat across from me in the booth and said, "Ray, this will go much smoother once you accept that things are changing." I asked what things specifically. He said, "Your role here. Claire agrees it's time." He laid his phone on the table. On the screen was a text from Claire. It read, "Brandon is right. Dad has been holding that place together on reputation for years. The regulars are aging out. He needs to hand it off before it declines." I read it twice without rushing. I slid the phone back. I said I'll be in touch when I've made my decision. What I did not say was that I had made it before I finished reading the third word of that text. And the decision was already in motion. Wednesday morning, I sat in Richard Knowles' office on Commerce Street in downtown Portland. Richard had handled my legal affairs for 18 years. He had 2 folders on his desk, and he already knew what was inside them. He said, "Raymond, before we begin, I need to ask one more time, are you certain? Because once we execute this process, it cannot be undone quietly." I told him I was certain. He opened the first folder. The lease for 447 Harbor Way was in my name, signed in 1991. Renewed 5 times. Current term extending through 2031. All equipment and fixtures owned outright. No debt. Liquor license. Health certifications. All permits Raymond Holt. He opened the second folder. Holt's Premium Catering LLC. Registered sole member Raymond Holt. 12 active corporate catering contracts. Combined. Annual value, $2.1 million. The commercial kitchen facility purchased outright in 2018. Separate address. Assessed at $430,000. Richard was quiet for a moment. He said Brandon believes he's positioning himself for a takeover of a restaurant doing roughly $400,000 in annual revenue. I said that was right. He said, while the actual total operation generates closer to $2.5 million annually. That's right. I said, "And Claire?" he asked. I was quiet for longer this time. Claire was my only child. I had raised her through Donna's 8 years of illness. Through the long, quiet years after. Through every graduation and failure, and ordinary Tuesday that adds up to a life. I had loved her from the moment she existed, and I was not going to stop. But Claire had told her husband in a private text that her father was holding his life's work together on reputation. I told Richard I want formal documentation filed with the LLC establishing that no transfer of authority has occurred and none can occur without my written consent. I want Brandon served with written notice that his restructuring proposal holds no legal validity. I want all 12 catering clients notified through official channels that Raymond Holt remains the sole operational authority of the company. Richard nodded and wrote, "And the manner of delivery," I said. "Brandon has been conducting his campaign in front of an audience for 6 months. He can receive the response the same way." Richard raised an eyebrow slightly. I said, "Not cruel. Clear." He wrote more notes. He asked when. I said, "1 more week. Let him make 1 more move. He will. He can't sit still when he believes the field is already his." Richard looked at me over his reading glasses. "You know him that well." After 6 months, I said, "I have known men like Brandon my entire professional life. They always make 1 more move when they believe they're about to win. And that move is always the one that tells you everything." Brandon made his move on Friday at 11 in the morning. He arrived with a locksmith. Luis, my kitchen manager, found me in the office and spoke quietly. There was a man changing the lock on the supply entrance. I walked out. Brandon was standing with his arms crossed, supervising the work with the easy authority of someone who has decided the legal situation is already resolved in his favor. He saw me approaching and raised one hand. He said, "Ray, for security purposes, Claire and I are standardizing the building's access credentials going forward. You'll receive a key. We just need to control distribution." I stopped and looked at the locksmith, then at Brandon. I asked, "Is this property in your name?" He said, "Ray, we have been over this." I said, "The lease is in my name. The business license is in my name. The catering LLC and its facility are in my name. You have no legal standing to change one piece of hardware on this building." He offered me the patient expression of someone managing a conversation with a person they consider confused. He said, "I know you're attached to how things used to work." I said, "Stop talking." He stopped. I said to the locksmith, "Put your tools away and go." The locksmith looked between us, made the only sensible choice, and picked up his bag. Brandon's composure shifted, just slightly. He said, "You are making this unnecessarily difficult." I said, "You made it as difficult as it needed to be." Then I went back inside and called Richard Noel. I said, "We're ready now." He said, "Monday morning." 10 a.m. Monday at 10, Richard and I walked into the offices of Meridian Commercial Development on 5th Avenue. Brandon was not there, but his two main professional contacts, Marcus Webb and Derek Cho, both senior agents who had been enthusiastically circulating Brandon's name as an emerging food industry operator to their networks, were seated in the conference room. And sitting at the far end of the table, completely unprepared for what she was about to see, was Claire. Brandon had asked her to attend what he described as a planning session for the new chapter of the business. She looked at me when I walked through the door with an expression I hadn't seen from her since she was 12 years old and had done something she knew was wrong and hadn't been caught yet. She said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" I said, "The same thing you are. Getting information." Richard opened his briefcase. He laid the lease on the table and let people read. He laid the LLC registration. He laid the catering contracts, the facility deed, the official notification that had already been sent to all 12 corporate clients that morning, confirming that Raymond Holt remained the sole operational authority of Holt's Premium Catering. Marcus Webb read in silence. Derek Cho sat very still. Derek said quietly, "Brandon represented himself to us as the incoming operational director of both the restaurant and the catering division. He told us the transition was complete and the paperwork was being finalized." Richard said, "No transfer of authority has taken place. No agreement has been reached. And no transfer can occur without Raymond Holt's written and notarized consent." He placed the cease and desist on the table, a formal legal document addressed to Brandon Cole, prohibiting him from representing himself as an officer, director, or authorized agent of any Holt business entity. Marcus Webb picked it up and read it slowly. When he put it down, something had changed in the room, the specific stillness that arrives when experienced professionals realize they have been making plans based on a false foundation. Derek Cho said, almost to himself, "We have already introduced him to 3 potential corporate clients as the new head of catering operations." Richard said, "All current clients have been formally notified this morning that no change in leadership has occurred." Derek looked at Marcus. A great deal of information passed between them without words. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. She said, "Dad, how long have you known all of this?" I said, "I have always known all of this. I have been deciding what to do with what I knew." She closed her eyes. She said, "I should have come to you myself." I said, "Yes." By Wednesday, the information had moved through Portland's professional community with the quiet efficiency of a correction that people needed to receive. Richard called to tell me Meridian Commercial had withdrawn from any planned involvement with Brandon's concept. Derek Cho sent a brief formal message that he would not be making further introductions pending review. 3 corporate catering clients who had been approached on Brandon's behalf called Holt's Premium Catering directly that week to confirm their contracts were intact and unchanged. Linda handled each call with the complete unflappable professionalism of someone who has worked alongside a business for 19 years and knows exactly what it is. On Thursday, Father Dominic from St. Michael's called to check on me personally. The week after the Meridian meeting, I received a card in the mail. No return address. Just a Portland postmark. Inside was a note from Gary, my head chef of 16 years, who had apparently heard everything through the restaurant's own communication channels. The note said, Ray, we've all known for a long time who built this place. We just waited for the right moment to let it show. I kept that card on my desk for a month. Some things are worth keeping. That was when I knew the information had reached every corner of Portland that mattered to my life. Claire came on Friday morning. She came alone. She sat at my kitchen table. Donna's kitchen table. The one we bought at an estate sale in 1989 because Donna said it was the right size for a family. I said it with such certainty even though we didn't have Claire yet, and she sat there a long time without saying anything. Finally, she said, I didn't know about the catering company. I told her I knew she didn't. She said I didn't understand any of it. Brandon showed me projection charts and competitive analysis and told me the restaurant had maybe 5 years left without new leadership. He made it sound like documented fact. I said spreadsheets are easy to build. Facts take years to falsify. She said I should have asked you instead of believing someone else's account of your own life. I said yes. She said I was afraid that if I asked you directly you'd tell me everything was fine, even if it wasn't. Because you always carry things quietly and never ask anyone for help with the weight. I thought about that. I said, Claire, carrying what you've built is not the same as struggling under something you can't manage. That's a distinction worth learning. She cried. I gave her the tissue box from the counter and did not fill the silence unnecessarily. I want to say something about that moment clearly because I think it matters. I did not enjoy watching Claire cry at my kitchen table. She is my daughter and I have spent her entire life making sure she did not have to cry at kitchen tables. But there are lessons that cannot be taught by someone who loves you. They can only be experienced. You can tell your children the truth about what you have built and what it cost you and what it is worth. But they will only really understand it when they stand close enough to almost lose it themselves. Claire understanding what I had built. Understanding what it had taken. Understanding what could have happened. That was not a punishment. That was the education I had not been able to give her while she was growing up because she was too young, and later because she didn't need it, and finally because she had been spending time with someone who had a different story about what her father was. When she was composed, she asked what happens now. I said that depends on the choices that get made from here. She said Brandon was consulting an attorney. I said he was welcome to. What he represented to others was his own decision, based on authority I had never granted. The legal exposure, if any, faced the other direction. She said, I'm sorry. Dad. I know. I said, I believe you. That's why I'm still sitting at this table with you instead of having this conversation through legal representation. Richard called Friday afternoon with the legal conclusion. Brandon's attorney had reviewed the complete documentation and advised that no viable claim existed. Brandon had presented himself as an authorized party based on his personal interpretation of a family connection, not on any executed agreement. Not on any legal instrument. Not on anything I had ever signed or verbally committed to. There was no case. Richard also mentioned a secondary development. One of the corporate clients approached on Brandon's behalf had filed a formal complaint with the Oregon Real Estate Agency regarding misrepresentation of professional authority in a business solicitation context. Brandon's real estate license was under administrative review. I had not initiated or suggested that complaint. The client had reached their own conclusion from the documentation Richard had shared with them. I sat with that for a while. The consequences of Brandon's actions were arriving not because I had engineered them, but because truth, given room to move, tends to go where it needs to go. 3 weeks later, I was doing an evening inventory check at the catering facility when my phone received a text from an unknown number. It said, Mr. Hoyt, this is Brandon Cole. I would very much appreciate a meeting if you're willing to give me one. I'll come to wherever works best for you. I stood in the quiet of the commercial kitchen, the stainless steel, and the refrigeration hum and the particular smell of a professional kitchen at rest, and I thought about Donna, who would have known exactly what to say back and said it in a way that left the person feeling they'd learned something without knowing when they started learning. I texted back Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. The restaurant. He arrived at 7:55. I'll give him that. He sat across from me in my corner booth, and he looked like a man who had spent 3 weeks having hard and necessary conversations with lawyers, with Claire, with himself. He said, I want to give you a direct and honest apology, and I'm not going to try to make it comfortable for either of us. I said, go ahead. He said, I walked into your family and your business, and I treated both like opportunities to exploit. I assumed you were more vulnerable than you were. I assumed Claire's relationship with you was leverage I could direct. I assumed the business was smaller and weaker than it turned out to be. Every assumption was wrong, and the consequences of those assumptions were mine to own. I asked him, what were you actually trying to accomplish? He was quiet. Then he said, I have been in a difficult professional period for longer than I admitted to anyone, including Claire. The commercial market here has been brutal. I looked at your business and I saw a way to rebuild my credibility and my professional standing by positioning myself as the leader of an established operation with a solid reputation. I thought if I could get inside the structure, I could grow it in ways that would benefit both of us. I said, you never considered simply asking me for help. He said, I was certain you would say no. I said, you were right. I would have said no to what you were proposing because what you proposed would have cost me what I spent 33 years building, and you hadn't given me any reason to trust you with it. He nodded. I said, but there is something else you should know. He waited. I said I would have helped you. Not with that plan. But if you had sat across from me in this booth 1 year ago and told me honestly that you were struggling, that your career was at a difficult point, and that you needed guidance, and maybe some introductions, I would have helped you. Because you married my daughter. That means something to me regardless of what you do with it. He looked at the table. I gave him a moment with it. Then I said the difference between what I would have offered willingly and what you tried to take by force, that is the entire lesson. He looked up. He said, Claire and I are in counseling. She wants the marriage to work. I want it to work. She has helped me understand in very specific terms what I actually did. I said, that's between you and her. I'm glad she's talking to you honestly. He stood and extended his hand. Then he stopped before leaving. He said, Mr. Holt, at the wedding reception, when I first told you about the restructuring, did you already know you had the legal standing to stop me at any point? I said, I have known my legal standing for 33 years. He said, then why wait so long? I said, because I wanted to see what kind of man you were when you believed nothing could stop you. He absorbed that. He said, and what did you see? I said, a man who was afraid and had not yet learned that fear is not a license. He left. I stayed in the booth with my coffee. I watched the morning light come through the windows Donna had chosen from a catalog 33 years ago because she said they would make the room feel open. The light she used to love on Saturday mornings when she'd come in early and sit in the corner before anyone arrived and drink her tea in the quiet of something that was still becoming what it would eventually be. Brandon's license review concluded 2 months later. The Oregon Real Estate Agency issued a formal professional reprimand and required mandatory ethics training. He kept his license. I had not wanted him to lose it. A reprimand stays in a professional record permanently. An ethics training requirement puts a person in a room where they have to hear, in structured and unavoidable detail, what they did and who it harmed and why it was wrong. That seemed like the right consequence. Not ending someone's livelihood. Teaching them why their actions had a cost. There is a difference between those two things, and I have believed in that difference my whole life. Claire came to Sunday dinner 6 weeks after the booth conversation. First alone, and then the following month with Brandon. He shook my hand at the door with a different grip, less presentation. More genuine. We ate and talked about things unconnected to business. Near the end of the meal, Brandon asked Luis about the produce sourcing he'd questioned months earlier, not from a position of authority. Not with the manner of someone running an assessment, but with the honest curiosity of a person who wants to understand how something they didn't build actually works. Luis walked him through the vendor relationship, why we'd stayed through price increases, what the consistency had meant over 15 years. Brandon listened without interrupting. Really listened. In the way that is different from waiting for your turn to speak. I caught Donna's photograph on the wall above the corner table, and I thought she would have approved of that. After dinner, Brandon helped clear the table without being asked. It was a small thing. But Donna always said a man's character lives in the small things nobody asked him to do. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated because you work without making noise about it, because you don't perform your accomplishments for an audience, because people have mistaken your steadiness for limitation, put something in the comments. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to let someone's assumptions run all the way to their conclusion before the truth could correct them? And if you've been on the other side, if you've been the one who made the assumptions, who had to sit across from someone you underestimated and figure out how to earn something back one small, honest thing at a time, I want to hear from you too. Until next time, quiet isn't weakness. Quiet is just patience. And patience, in my experience, outlasts almost everything.